So you've probably heard the news by now that the Pfizer vaccine has been fully approved, fully licensed by the FDA, which has a number of different implications that are important to talk about. We got David Helfrich here to explore this a little bit. David, specifically when it comes to existing legal cases that were there for people seeking exemption from the vaccine, how does this approval affect those legal cases?
What's going on, Joe? It's good to be with you today. This is obviously pretty significant news. From a legal perspective, really what this means is that although employers had already mandated vaccination under the EUA, not too many of them did. And there were a lot of them who were kind of waiting in the cut, waiting for the full FDA approval because they were more comfortable from a legal perspective mandating these vaccines, this one in particular, Pfizer, now that it's been granted full FDA approval. However, what's interesting is that there have been a lot of legal challenges to the vaccine mandates across the country, citing the EUA. So this is kind of a major blow to those lawsuits, because the biggest difference here is that it will take away most of the lawsuits against the vaccine mandates if those lawsuits primarily cited the fact that these vaccines have only been approved under emergency use authorization. Now that we have full FDA approval, those lawsuits will probably get thrown out. That said, there are still a myriad of lawsuits that cited the EUA as just one facet of why they were challenging these mandates. So those lawsuits will likely still continue, and it'll be a long time before those are properly adjudicated to where we understand where the case law is going. But for sure, for a lot of legal challenges, the fact that this particular vaccine has been granted full FDA approval is a major blow with serious legal implications that will greatly inhibit the ability of some of these lawsuits to go through and be effective and be successful.
I have a question here with regards to this, and there may not be an obvious answer, because I'll admit, some of what's in this document that the FDA put out is a little bit confusing. The FDA document distinguishes between the new branded vaccines that have a specific name, Comirnaty, and the old vaccines that are just go by the name, the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, and they're saying there's a legal distinction between those two vaccines. So the old doses, right, and then the new doses, legal distinction, but that the vaccines are both safe and effective. Now, the older vaccines are technically still operating under the EUA, whereas the new vaccines, the new doses, are fully licensed. Can these legal cases that are how does somebody know if they're citing the EUA? How does somebody know that the doses that they're getting, which legally are still extended under the EUA, what if they're getting some of those old doses? I'm very sort of confused as to what's going on here with some of this language.
Yeah, and you're not the only one, Joe. I mean, a lot of this has been confusing, and to be fair, there hasn't been a lot of transparency and really recent discussion about this. But essentially, when the full FDA approval is granted for this Pfizer vaccine, now that opens up branding in the marketplace. And as you noted, under the full FDA approval, the vaccine is now branded under a particular name. So when it's in use now, it'll be under that brand name so that there's marketplace recognition. So previously, when you went to get vaccinated under the EUA, obviously it did not have this branding. So you were taking an EUA vaccine, and there were a lot of stipulations and things you had to agree to and acknowledge before you went and received your vaccine under the EUA. Now, because there's full FDA approval, there's going to be different literature. There's going to be a different brand name associated with this vaccine. So essentially, this is just a differentiation in the marketplace so that people can distinguish between a vaccine that has full FDA approval and actually has a brand associated with it,
yeah,
versus the other vaccines like Moderna, which still are only authorized under the EUA.
Right. Yeah. And this obviously too, once this approval comes out, we see that mandates, get a big push, right? I mean, we saw that the Pentagon, for example, said that we weren't going to, mandate vaccines to our people until there was, full FDA approval. What have you seen with regards to mandates now that the FDA approval is there?
Right. So it's been, I mean, to be honest, it's been pretty astonishing to see how quickly some of these employers, both private employers and federal employers, have rolled out the mandates immediately after this full FDA approval. I mean, on Monday, CVS Health announced that employees would have to be vaccinated by October 31st. New York City Department of Education will now require employees to receive their first dose by September 27th. The Pentagon, which incidentally is the world's largest employer, will now mandate these vaccines soon as well. Chevron, a myriad of companies are now coming out who are, by the way, companies that aren't necessarily associated with the healthcare industry either. Those have been pretty steadfast and clear that they're going to mandate vaccination regardless of the EUA status or the full FDA approval. But a myriad of private employers are now doing that as well, including the Department of Defense. So
Yeah.
we're going to see this continue to occur and roll out. And clearly, the trending trajectory is for vaccine mandates to continue to occur.
Yeah, and it feels like that also is going to mean vaccine passports in most places. I know it's happening here in provinces in Canada. You know, it's happening in Europe, and we're probably going to see more states in the U.S. Where that's happening as well. What legal implications, or I guess what legal options, if you will, do people who still don't want to receive the vaccine, what do they have, for example, in the United States? Maybe we could distinguish between their rights going into places that require a vaccine passport in comparison to, hey, maybe my employer is really pushing me to get a vaccine and I don't want to. What rights and legal ramifications are there for people?
So those are different, two different situations there. So if you're going into a private restaurant or a cafe and they're saying, you know, you have to show your vaccine card, for example, for entry, there's not a lot of rights you have there.
Yeah.
Because it's a private entity and you know, the burden on you to just go to another restaurant is not that big, as recognized under the law. However, if your employer is mandating that, you certainly have more rights. I mean, you can claim a religious exemption, you can claim a medical exemption. There's been an interesting case in Ohio, I think from several years ago, but in that case, the plaintiff actually succeeded, and the claim was that the person was practiced a vegan lifestyle, and because of that, they objected to the animal testing and a flu vaccine.
Yep.
And the court actually acknowledged that and said, yes, you're exempt because of this belief. So there's actually, you know, the religious exemption is actually broader than I think we often conceive.
Yeah.
So there are some rights, but certainly with this full FDA approval, those rights are going to be a lot more difficult to claim.
Right, and then so from an employer standpoint, when we're talking about medical exemption, I've heard, and this is more of an anecdote, that a lot of doctors are not willing to write any form of medical exemption for people. Further to that, I've heard that, you know, for example, here in Canada, and this, I know this is outside your law training, but here in Canada, like some private businesses and so on and so forth have said, you know what, we're not accepting any religious or medical exemptions. Do you have any thoughts on you know, I know we looked into it quickly, just the rights in Canada and how they differ with regards to that and employees?
For sure. Well, first I would you know, offer the caveat that if people have questions about this, they should definitely consult with a Canadian lawyer, which I am not. But what's interesting is the difference. There is a distinction between Canadian law and U.S. law in general as it pertains to this. In Canada, if you are a government worker, you do have what's called charter rights. So you are afforded the religious and medical exemptions under Canadian law. And there are some nuanced differences there for sure. But if you are a private employee and your employer is in the private sector in Canada, you don't have a lot of rights whatsoever as it pertains to this. Certainly less rights than we have here in the United States, where regardless of whether it's a private or public employer, they have to offer these exemptions and reasonable accommodations under the law. So, you know, this can get pretty tricky. And the interesting point you pointed out about doctors who are hesitant to grant these medical exemptions, that's definitely been the case. And I've heard of that as well. But the important thing is under the law, it can't be just sort of a thing, well, I'm just kind of suspicious of these vaccines.
Yeah.
You have to actually demonstrate that there's an allergic reaction that you have based on your medical history that exempts you from having to take the vaccine, or some you know, issue with your immune system or other health issue, which renders it impractical and then potentially dangerous for you to take the vaccine.
Yeah.
So doctors are hesitant to give that. However, if you have a legitimate medical reason to do so, a doctor is required to grant that exemption.
But what happens in cases like, for example, obviously when it comes to vaccines like this, nobody's held liable for any injury. I mean, I've seen stories of people that you know, were pressured by their friends and family to get a vaccine. You know, they were calling them names and this, that, whatever. They eventually did it, and now they have neurological issues that they're going to deal with for the rest of their life. That's a single anecdotal case that I'm looking at. But just to lay it out there, you know, that person obviously now is not going to be supported by anybody financially for how their life has changed. What if, under the way that the studies have been done with regards to these vaccines, there's not an acknowledged condition that could be problematic in relation to these vaccines, and a person goes, look, I have a specific condition. I know it's not on the Pfizer vaccine study list that says here's the potential problems. Can doctors go outside their bounds a little bit and make a judgment call that says, hey, here's a medical exemption? Could they be held liable for anything at some point? Like, what happens in that type of situation?
That's an interesting question. I think it's unlikely, particularly because the doctor can always err on the side of caution, meaning if there's any question in their mind from a medical perspective that a vaccine would pose significant harm to the patient, I think they're going to be generally protected in making that decision and pushing for a medical exemption for that particular patient.
Yeah.
Because as you noted, unfortunately, the vaccine manufacturers are wholly immune from liability for what happens to people when they take the vaccine. So people have to understand that they're taking an assumption of risk when they do that, and they should exercise. Listen, if people have serious concerns about taking the vaccine, they should explore all of their legal rights, whether that's a religious exemption, a medical exemption, or discuss with their employer what reasonable accommodations can be made. Can I work from home? Can I wear a mask when I'm in the facility? Can I work remote so that my chances are mitigated? Can I take a test before coming in each week to ensure that I'm not positive with COVID-19, et cetera, et cetera. So in the U.S. at least, there are some options people can exhaust from a legal perspective. Meeting with their doctors, another one, to see if they'll qualify for a medical exemption. So for sure, there are some options people have.
Yeah, and I would argue, just for people watching this that might be feeling a little bit bleak, I've even heard of situations here in Canada where employers, have said this is more on a contractual agreement, on a good faith between their employees, that regardless of mandates, if you want to work from home, you can do that. And so I would encourage people, just doubling up on what you just said there. If you're worried about whether your employer maybe in Canada might, or even if you're anywhere else really, might wanting to let you go based on vaccine status, make the good faith effort. Go talk to them. Say, hey, look, I'm really hoping to make this decision. I'm open to what can be done here, and let's explore some options. And I know that doesn't always feel good when we're dealing with the type of situation that we're in, but at least it's something that we can work with in the short term.
We also have seen and observed some people saying that actually this vaccine didn't receive full FDA approval.
Yeah.
That in fact, this is a sham, and essentially what we're reporting on isn't actually true. Mm-hmm. And the challenge of operating in conscious media, the space that we're operating in, is that, it requires obviously the viewer to have an open mind, but it doesn't require the viewer to just completely reject any sense of reality or fact that's happening on the ground, to where we can actually agree on a baseline of facts so that we can actually then have a discussion on it. I noticed that in our discussions, you were mentioning how some people were even coming at you and calling you a shill and other names simply because you were reporting that the vaccine received full FDA approval.
Yeah.
I'm curious from your perspective, how do you deal with that as a journalist, somebody who's been operating in the space for as long as you've been? And, and is this something that you found to be sort of a consistent trend in the alternative media space?
Yeah, interestingly, with regards to that, I wrote the article, and within about hours, I started to see basically a screenshot circulating. Hey, look at this paragraph. It's on page 1213 of the Pfizer document, and it's got the red circle around it. Look, this says it wasn't actually approved, and where the confusion came from was when people were reading through the document, they were misinterpreting the licensed new doses of vaccines with the old existing doses of vaccines, and how these are existing, whatever, these are still going to be under the EUA for probably a number of legal reasons that are complicated, whereas these new doses, they're absolutely 100% licensed, they're good to go, la-di-da. And the document, at least in my opinion, makes that clear, but a lot of people were just looking at that one paragraph and saying, look, it's not like they're pulling a fast one on everybody. And no matter how many times I tried to explain the situation to people, I provided a ton of other resources online from both alternative and mainstream that also came to that conclusion. there's this like, no, you're wrong, you're a shill, you're this, you're that, you don't know how to do your research, whatever, la da da. I think this really comes down to, if it's in the alternative, it has to be true for alternative people, and if it's in the mainstream, it has to be absolutely false, right? And this sort of blanket, no nuance approach that happens in both mainstream and alternative media, I think is just really harmful to the overall information landscape, as a whole. It's like we're looking to just kind of have our side or our perspective, upheld, regardless of what the information actually says. And as we continue on that path, we're creating greater extremes and greater divisiveness. I would argue that there's almost as much divisiveness created in the alternative space as there is in the mainstream space, right? And so in terms of like how we respond to that, it's like, you say what you can say, but people are still going to say their bit, and that's what it is. It's an odd place to be in with regards to that. But yeah, it's funny that we can't even come to an agreement as people on something as simple as, yeah, these vaccines were approved by the FDA. So that's what I found comical.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it is troubling in the sense when you see how this type of information spreads, right? Somebody can just screenshot a meme, and then maybe it'll get thousands and thousands of spreads across the internet. And because of that, people tend to think it's legitimate. Oh, well, there must be something to this. And you pair that with there's an understandable distrust of institutional authority anyway, which is understandable, but that doesn't mean we just sort of abandon all sense of reason when it comes to analyzing news and analyzing things that are happening in our world. And what I found kind of troubling as well is, and we talked about this before, in the vein of spiritual bypassing, essentially where people are kind of implying that if you just sort of vibrate on a different dimensional reality, then the full FDA approval never happened in that reality. And while we can theorize all day about multiple dimensions and understanding the value of creating our own world and living in our own reality, which does have utility, we can't do that if we're just living in a fantasy world where we have no grasp of the reality and the things that are happening on the ground, because we are in the physical body and we have to deal with the physical reality. So I think it's actually irresponsible for people to be pushing these kind of narratives out there. I think a lot of people are willingly, knowingly pushing these narratives, knowing it's false, just to sort of kind of mock what's happening in the reality. And I'm not sure that there's a lot of value we can attach to that, particularly when we're dealing with a world that's extraordinarily complicated, layered, and complex.
Indeed, that was well said. There's a lot there, and I think this is where I got to throw in a plug for our course on overcoming bias and improving critical thinking, which a lot of it is an inner journey of that, right? That course we have in our membership is something that I think is extremely valuable for improving the way you observe information, move through information, understanding yourself, your thought patterns, the way you feel inside, the way we react emotionally to things. Extremely powerful course. I got to throw that out there. But David, thanks for all your clarity and wisdom and perspective on this particular issue. It's a big one that I think is going to move things forward very quickly with this vaccine mandate situation.
For sure. You already know, Joe. It's good to be with you.